York, this is Democracy Now!
This is a sad day. When our founders drafted the Constitution more than 230 years ago, they included a process that could lead to removing a president from office if he or she abused their power. That is what separates America from so many other nations. There are no kings or queens here, and no one is above the law.
The House is voting today to formalize the impeachment process. It marks the first vote by the full House related to the impeachment inquiry of President Trump. We'll get the latest. But first, we look at the climate crisis as Chile cancels the upcoming UN climate summit due to weeks of mass street protests.
This has been a difficult decision, a decision that causes us much pain, because we perfectly understand the importance of APEC and COP for Chile and the world.
This comes as a major new study warns 300 million people are at risk from rising sea levels, 3 times more than previous estimates. Plus, we go to California, where extreme winds of up to 60 miles per hour cause new fires to erupt across Southern California. We'll speak with Congressmember Ro Khanna about the growing calls to make Pacific Gas and Electric a public utility. We'll also speak to a woman who risked her life while fighting fires as a prisoner in California.
I made about 53 cents an hour. My total check per month was about somewhere around $64, I believe, and I was one of the highest paid at the fire department. So the other women that I worked side by side with were making about 38 cents an hour.
Plus, we speak to a reporter at the Los Angeles Times about her story, Housekeepers and Gardeners Go to Work Despite the Flames. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In California, extreme winds of up to 60 miles per hour caused new fires to erupt across the southern part of the state Wednesday. In Ventura County, north of Los Angeles, the so-called Easy Fire came nearly to the doorstep of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library as hundreds of firefighters worked to control the blazes. This is Simi Valley resident David Pollack, one of 30,000 residents of the region forced to evacuate the climate change-fueled fires.
As long as we get up, get out of here, get the car moving, everything else can be replaced in theory. So, breathing at the end of the day is better than not breathing at the end of the day.
Chile's President Sebastián Piñera announced Wednesday his nation will not be hosting the UN Climate Summit in Santiago in December as planned. The UN said it's now looking for an alternative venue. Piñera also canceled the scheduled Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Conference, that's APEC, as mass protests against inequality in Chile enter their third week. His announcement came as a shocking new report warns 300 million people are at risk from rising sea levels, 3 times more than previous estimates. We'll have more on the fires in California and the report after headlines. In Los Angeles, protesters interrupted J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon Wednesday as he appeared at a forum on the campus of UCLA, chanting, "Jamie Dimon, the world's on fire," unfurling banners calling on the bank to end its investments in coal, oil, and gas. The Rainforest Action Network reports J.P. Morgan Chase invested nearly $200 billion in fossil fuel projects after the Paris Climate Agreement was reached in late 2015. On Capitol Hill, 50 youth climate activists with the Sunrise Movement occupied the offices of California Senator Dianne Feinstein and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi Wednesday, demanding meaningful action on climate change. Organizer Claire Teixeira Morrison said in a statement, quote, "Democratic leadership is failing to treat this like the emergency that it is. Business as usual is killing us," she said. In North Dakota, a breach in the Keystone Pipeline Wednesday flooded a rural wetland with crude oil from Canada's tar sands. Walsh County Emergency Management distributed photos of the massive spill, which it said was over a quarter-mile long and 15 feet wide. The agency said the pipeline's operator, TC Energy, formerly known as TransCanada, had yet to fix the leak by late Wednesday and that an unknown quantity of oil had leaked. The House of Representatives is voting today to formalize the impeachment process, marking the first vote by the full House related to the impeachment inquiry of President Donald Trump. This comes as the top Russia official on the National Security Council, Tim Morrison, is scheduled to testify on Capitol Hill today. On Wednesday, it was reported Morrison will soon step down from his post. Meanwhile, House Democrats have asked Trump's former National Security Advisor John Bolton to testify, but his attorney says he would not appear unless he is subpoenaed. Later in the broadcast, we'll go to Washington, D.C. to speak with California Congressmember Ro Khanna about the latest on the impeachment inquiry. On Capitol Hill, Democrats on the House Oversight Committee grilled senior immigration official Ken Cuccinelli Wednesday over his agency's moves to deport immigrants receiving life-saving medical treatment, including children and babies. In September, following public outcry, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services reversed its decision to end deferred deportations for immigrants with serious medical conditions. At Wednesday's hearing, Missouri Democratic Congressmember William Clay pressed Cuccinelli, the acting director of USCIS, over the cases of parents of critically ill newborn babies who were told they had 33 days to leave the United States or face deportation.
You want them to leave the country, pack up their stuff, take their sick child and go?
Either that or make their case in the immigration process where it's appropriate to do so.
All in the middle of them being there trying, hoping and praying that they save their child's life.
Which is why deferred action continues to exist elsewhere in DHS.
How cruel. Really? Really? I don't believe this. I yield back.
President Trump's nominee to fill an open seat on the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, Nevada lawyer Lawrence Van Dyke, broke down in tears Wednesday as lawmakers questioned him about the American Bar Association's finding that he's not qualified to become a federal judge. In a scathing letter to leaders of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the ABA determined Van Dyke to be, quote, arrogant, lazy, an ideologue, and lacking in knowledge of the day-to-day practice, including procedural rules. And went on to say he, quote, lacks humility, has an entitlement temperament, does not have an open mind, does not always have a commitment to being candid and truthful. The report also said Van Dyke would not promise to be fair to members of the LGBTQ community. On Wednesday, Van Dyke broke down in tears when asked about the findings at his Senate confirmation hearing.
No, I did not say that. I do not believe that. It is a fundamental belief of mine that all people are created in the image of God. They should all be treated with dignity and respect.
Van Dyke has previously taken hardline positions against gun control, marriage equality, and abortion. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi tightened his control over Kashmir on Wednesday as his government announced plans to split the state of Jammu and Kashmir into two federal territories controlled directly by New Delhi. Over the summer, massive protests erupted after Modi revoked the special status of the Indian-controlled part of the Muslim-majority region. Human rights groups say Modi's government then carried out widespread torture, extrajudicial killings, arbitrary arrests, and other crimes in Kashmir. Meanwhile, Kashmiri militants shot dead 5 construction workers from eastern India Wednesday. The latest violence came as a group of European Union lawmakers from far-right parties toured Kashmir in a move decried by human rights groups as a PR stunt. The 27 parliamentarians from countries including France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and the UK met with Modi for a photo op on Monday. The Pentagon has released video of the U.S. military assault on the compound in Syria that it says killed ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and 2 of his children on Saturday when he blew up his suicide vest in a tunnel. The head of U.S. Central Command, General Frank McKenzie, said Wednesday al-Baghdadi's remains were buried at sea and that the U.S. was on alert for retribution attacks. The video does not contain any audio of the assault, casting further doubt on President Trump's lurid account made to a national audience Sunday morning that Baghdadi died, quote, whimpering, crying, and screaming. In the Philippines, a powerful 6.6 magnitude earthquake rattled the southern island of Mindanao on Thursday morning, 2 days after a similarly sized quake killed 8 people, flattened buildings, and left more than 12,000 people homeless. Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro lashed out Wednesday at Brazil's largest media company, Globo, after a broadcaster report alleging a link between Bolsonaro and 2 men accused of murdering the Rio de Janeiro city councilwoman Marielle Franco in March of last year. Globo quoted a doorman who said one of the murder suspects, alleged getaway driver Elcio de Queiroz, arrived at Bolsonaro's gated community on the night of the murder and was granted access after calling Bolsonaro's residence. De Queiroz then drove to the home of the second suspect in the murder, alleged triggerman Rani Lessa, who has a residence in the same area. Bolsonaro has denied knowing the suspects, even though he appears in a photograph circulated on social media with De Queiroz, and one of his sons once dated Rani Lessa's daughter. Bolsonaro recorded an angry 23-minute diatribe early Wednesday morning from a hotel room in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia.
But now you try to link me to the murder of Marielle. You jerks of TV Globo. You jerks. You scoundrels. This will not stick. I don't owe anyone anything.
Não vai colar. Não devo nada a ninguém. Não tinha motivo nenhum para matar quem quer que seja no Rio de Janeiro.
I had no reason to kill anyone in Rio de Janeiro. I knew about this councilwoman. I found out about her on the day she was murdered, which by coincidence was March 14th. For the love of God, where are your heads? You have no common sense, TV Globo.
In a statement, the Committee to Protect Journalists responded, quote, President Bolsonaro's threats and insults against Brazil's largest news broadcaster have no place in a democracy, unquote. Bolsonaro's tirade came ahead of a fiery address to the Saudi investment forum in Riyadh known as Davos in the Desert. In the speech, President Bolsonaro praised Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Donald Trump while blasting French President Emmanuel Macron, who criticized Bolsonaro's support for the illegal ranchers and miners behind many of the fires sweeping the Amazon rainforest. Colombia's government says it's deploying the military to the southwestern province of Cauca after 5 indigenous people were murdered on their reservation. 6 others were wounded in Tuesday's attack after heavily armed assailants opened fire with guns and grenades on a convoy of people responsible for security in the semi-autonomous Nasatuqueo Indigenous Reserve. Among the dead was community leader Cristina Bautista. Colombian President Ivan Duque traveled to the region Wednesday, blaming dissidents in the FARC rebel group who oppose a peace deal, but police have made no arrests and no suspects have been named in the murders. Twitter says it will stop accepting all political advertisements worldwide beginning in November. CEO Jack Dorsey announced the change in a series of tweets Wednesday, writing, quote, while Internet advertising is incredibly powerful and very effective for commercial advertisers, that power brings significant risks to politics where it can be used to influence votes to affect the lives of millions, he said. Twitter's move comes as Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg is under fire for accepting political advertisements, even when politicians like President Trump make demonstrably false or misleading claims. A forensic pathologist hired by the brother of Jeffrey Epstein says the injuries that killed the multimillionaire sex abuser were consistent with strangulation, not a death by suicide, as a New York Medical Examiner reported. Dr. Michael Baden says a broken bone in Epstein's neck is, quote, extremely unusual in suicidal hangings and could occur much more commonly in homicidal strangulation, unquote. Epstein was found dead in his Manhattan jail cell in August as he awaited trial on federal sex trafficking charges. Jeffrey Epstein once counted President Trump and former President Bill Clinton among his high-profile friends. In Britain, Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn's formally announced he will challenge Prime Minister Boris Johnson in an election scheduled for December 12th.
Today, we launch the most ambitious and radical campaign our country has ever seen to bring real change to all parts of this country. If you want to live in a society that works for everybody, not just the billionaires, if you want to save our hospitals, schools and public services from Tory cuts and privatisation, if you want to stop the big polluters destroying our environment, then this election is your chance to vote for it.
The Chicago Teachers Union reached a tentative contract agreement Wednesday with the city's public school system, but returned to picket lines today after Mayor Lori Lightfoot refused their request to add extra school days to this year's calendar to make up for class time lost to the strike. The tentative deal would bring Chicago teachers a 16% pay raise over 5 years and would add $35 million to efforts to reduce class sizes. In related news, SEIU Local 73, the union representing Chicago school support staff, approved their new contract, with 97% of the workers voting yes and a strong vow to stay in solidarity with the Chicago Teachers Union. Their deal follows a 7-day strike. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. As wildfires continue to rage in California, and a shocking new report finds that many coastal cities will be permanently flooded by rising sea levels, Chile's President Sebastián Piñera has cancelled the upcoming UN Climate Summit. The 2-week summit had been scheduled for December in the Chilean capital of Santiago, which has seen weeks of mass protests against the Chilean government's neoliberal policies. The UN is now looking for an alternative venue. The annual climate meetings offer a critical space for developing countries to request greater help from rich nations as they confront the worst effects of the climate crisis. Piñera's announcement comes as a dire new report warns 300 million people are at risk of being displaced due to rising sea levels, 3 times more than previous estimates. According to the study published in Nature Communications, the vast majority of the most vulnerable populations are concentrated in Asia, with China, Bangladesh, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand facing the gravest threat.
The study finds global sea levels are expected to rise between 2 to 7 feet and possibly more, with some coastal cities being wiped off the map. To talk more about the implications of the latest report, we're joined by 2 guests. Here in New York, Benjamin Strauss is with us, CEO and chief scientist at Climate Central and co-author of the new study on rising sea levels. Harjeet Singh is the global lead on climate change at ActionAid, working with climate migrants in a number of countries, joining us from New Delhi, India. We begin with Benjamin Strauss. Explain the report, the scope of the report and what you found.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Amy and Nermeen, to discuss such an important issue. We found that the global exposure to sea level rise and coastal flooding in the coming several decades is more than 3 times what we thought based on previous data. Essentially, almost all of climate science has been focused on the question of what the sea level will be in the future, which makes sense. That's what's changing. Sea level is rising. But you really need to know 2 things to understand the human vulnerability to sea level rise. And one is the height of the sea, but the other is the height of the land. We all assumed that we knew that it was fixed and simple. But in my research with my colleague Scott Culp, we took a closer look at the data being used to estimate land elevations globally. And while there's very accurate data in the United States and Australia and parts of Western Europe, the data set used for global analysis and most of Asia and the rest of the world overestimated coastal elevations by more than 6 feet or 2 meters.
Why did they do that? Why was there such a huge overestimation?
The elevation was based on measurements taken from satellites. So basically the sensing beams that came down were very broad in their footprint, and so averaged in rooftops, buildings, treetops with the ground in determining the elevation in the data set.
Let's look at a map depicting southern Vietnam could all but disappear by 2050. In Shanghai, one of Asia's most important economic engines, water threatens to consume the heart of the city and many other cities around it.
Yes. So we've made an interactive map. We published a map together with the report so that any of your listeners can look really in any part of the world if they go to coastal.climatecentral.org. And we found huge changes in the major deltas of Asia compared to what we had previously thought. Now, it is worth also noting that we discovered more than 100 million people today live on land that's below the high tide line. And there's a little piece of hope in that, which is that means that most of them are likely to be protected by coastal defenses to some degree. But on the other hand, it also means that many people, we may not hear about it in the headlines, many people may already be suffering from frequent flooding and inundation affecting their lives and livelihoods.
And the new findings are based on an innovative way to read satellites?
Yes. So what we did is we used artificial intelligence to try and improve on this elevation data from satellites. We took that satellite-based data set, but another 23 variables, and we fed it into a big algorithm soup, so to speak, in order to try and find an approach to improve those data. And we used about 50 million data points where we had a very accurate elevation reading, as well as the inaccurate satellite reading, to develop and calibrate the model. And then we used completely different sets of points in other areas to show that the model worked, even outside of the areas where we trained it. So that's how we have confidence in these results.
Well, I'd like to bring Harjeet Singh into the conversation. Harjeet Singh is with Action Aid, and he's joining us from New Delhi, India. Harjeet, could you respond to the findings of this report, and in particular the fact that the vast majority of the most vulnerable areas vulnerable to sea level rise, are in Asia?
Yeah, thank you for having me here. Well, I'm saddened, but not surprised. We are already seeing such grim reality in different parts of the global south. So developing countries who had little role in causing the problem are already facing this climate emergency. Just to put it into context, 16 million people were displaced in 2018 by weather-related disasters. And now the estimates that are coming for sea level rise, if I talk of India, it's 7 times more the number. And in Bangladesh, it's going to be 8 times more than the previous estimate. And people are being forced to leave their homes as their local coping mechanisms fail. Their farms and homes are being swallowed up by sea. I've met people who would point towards the sea several meters in from the shoreline to where their homes used to be and are now underwater. Now, that's the grim reality they are facing. They leave their families behind, particularly women, children, and elderly. And we are seeing in this part of the world how families are getting disintegrated completely, and they have no place to go. And where they land up in urban areas, in small towns and cities, they end up living in inhuman and unhygienic conditions. So that's the reality which we are already facing. And with these numbers, it becomes absolutely horrific.
And Harjeet, can you talk about what kind of support, if any, these climate migrants receive to help them move or resettle wherever they're able to go?
Well, the reality is that developing countries are also not ready. We are now facing the climate emergency, or what we call it loss and damage in the climate parlance. They have not even been ready with their adaptation plans. The whole concept of adaptation, which means preparing for these impacts, became much more active into 2001. And since then, they have not got any support from developed countries, which is adequate for them to put these defenses that we are talking about, whether it's about coastal protection, whether it's about retrofitting homes, or thinking of planned relocation, which is being talked about now at the UN level, but hardly any support has reached these communities. And we are talking of millions and millions of people in this part of the world.
Harjeet Singh, can you talk about this latest news that just broke yesterday, as more than 1 million people were in the streets of Chile this past weekend? The embattled president, Piñera, announced that the UN climate summit would be canceled in December. It was going to be held in Santiago. Now the UN has to decide whether they have to put off this climate summit or they will find an alternative venue. But the significance of the cancellation at this point.
Well, let's understand the climate crisis and the social unrest in Chile or elsewhere have the same root cause. That's inequality. Governments continue to prioritize corporations over the rights of people. And that's why this uprising, this unrest that we have seen in Chile. Now, with climate conference COP25 being cancelled, it means it's a major jolt to the issue that we were supposed to be talking there. Loss and damage, the challenges that climate migrants are facing was very much on the agenda. And it was all about how the institution that has been created in 2013 needs to be rebooted so that it can respond to the current reality and the future. So if I connect with what's happening in Chile, what the COP was going to be discussing, and this new report, I think it's really a terrible situation that we now will see these COP moving to some other city and probably for 2020. Our thoughts are with people of Chile. The fight that they're fighting is absolutely real. And as I said, the climate justice fight and the social unrest, they are all connected to the core cause of inequality. And we need to recognize that core cause behind these challenges.
And Harjeet, can you talk about that inequality also in the context of climate change, that countries that have historically emitted the least are now the most vulnerable?
Absolutely. So if you look at historical emissions, so the climate crisis that we are facing today is not a result of emissions that are happening now. It's the climate works on a lag system. So the emissions that have taken place in the last 150 years are causing the climate crisis that we face today. And if you look at these historical emissions, United States is responsible for more than quarter, and another quarter emissions come from European Union. Now that's the inequality. Yes, China is the biggest polluter at the moment, but historical emissions come largely from United States and European Union. And if you look at the emission reduction targets that they have put on the table from United States, European Union, and even Japan, it's 1/5 of their fair share. So civil society organizations have come up with this calculator that looks at their historical responsibility, their GDP, and their capability. And through that solid assessment, we have found that it's only 1/5. And developing countries, on the contrary, have put their plans, which are far more ambitious, and most of them are in line with keeping the temperature below 2 degrees Celsius. So that inequality, which has caused the problem, also exists when it comes to climate action. And the business as usual approach that we see from majority of developed countries is not going to help. We need to be responding to the grave situation that we are facing at this moment.
I want to ask you about Indonesia announcing plans to relocate its capital. The capital city is Jakarta. It is going to relocate to the island of Borneo. Jakarta, which is home to over 30 million people, has been steadily sinking into the Java Sea. A study found over a quarter of Jakarta will be underwater within the next 10 years. Excessive extraction of groundwater, poorly managed environmental policies have led to Jakarta's surface water becoming polluted and unfit for consumption. Rising sea levels from climate change further compound the issue. This is the Indonesian president, Joko Widodo, announcing the plans.
The place has a minimum risk of natural disasters, such as floods, earthquakes, tsunami, forest fires, volcanoes, and landslides. Secondly, the location is strategic, as it's located in the center of Indonesia. And thirdly, it's close to the other developed cities.
It's not clear what will happen to the millions of Jakarta residents at risk of losing their homes and livelihoods as Jakarta is submerged in the coming years. But I want to ask each of you this question, starting with Harjeet Singh.
See, everything points to the unsustainable development model that we have created that continues to exploit nature, whether it's about extraction of water at unsustainable levels and man-made crisis called climate change that we have caused. I think we need to look at how we how we treat development. What is our definition of development, and who is causing that destruction? Some of these fundamental questions we need to ask are the whole orientation towards GDP growth and completely ignoring what we are doing to environment has to change. Environment now has to be at the center of everything that we are doing, how we are using our natural resources, how we are building our homes, how we are using water. All that has to change. And that thinking is not yet there despite some of these challenges that we are seeing, and look at the kind of actions we are now forced to take. But our political leaders are still stuck with that thinking that corporations are going to solve the problem, and we are seeing privatization and not really rebooting the development model that we have created, which is responsible for all the crisis that we are facing in this world today.
And Ben Strauss.
Yes, well, I think we have to look at Jakarta and really use it to understand we could all be Jakarta tomorrow. Unfortunately, it's a model for what could happen to many other coastal cities. Or we could look at New Orleans, which has more resources and has built a levee system to protect itself. But when a hurricane comes, we saw the tragedy that can take place when you live in the bottom of a bowl and the defenses fail. So I think it's a really, really important lesson that we have to take great heed of, that a major nation would go to the length of relocating their largest city and their capital city, or trying to do that.
And very quickly, before we conclude, a city like Bombay, a population of almost 20 million,
yes.
And the greater Bombay area, large parts of which will be underwater, according to this report, by 2050. That area includes where 2 nuclear installations are housed.
Oh, there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure right by the coast everywhere, including nuclear facilities, hazardous waste sites of every kind. And as if the ocean rises to submerge those areas, right, all kinds of nuclear waste or toxins and other noxious materials can be spread around. So we have an enormous cleanup or better defense effort in front of us. This is an entirely new problem in the course of human civilization. We really don't have the institutions or the precedent to deal with the loss of land. And I hope that with adequate warning, decades of warning, we have some chance of finding and investing resources to defend the places that we are able. But there's a great inequity of resources around the world. It's going to be very expensive. And some places, just by their geography, may be prohibitive to defend. So, yes, this really is a new chapter. And if I can find any silver lining in this, and it's hardly one, but I'll say that just as the threat from sea level rise and coastal flooding turns out to be much greater than we thought it was.
3 times greater. 300 million
3 times greater.
People will be affected.
The benefits of cutting climate pollution would also be 3 times greater, right? So think of the benefit-cost equation that moves some audiences. It suddenly changed. But on the other hand, Harjeet made a very important point, is that there is a lag in the system. So if I put a chunk of ice on the table in front of us right now, it's very simple and profound, it wouldn't melt instantly. It would take time. So in the same way, the ice sheets on Antarctica and Greenland have just barely begun to respond to the warming that we have already caused.
We want to thank you so much for being with us. Benjamin Strauss, Chief Scientist at the news and science organization Climate Central, and Harjeet Singh, Global Lead on Climate Change at Action Aid, speaking to us from New Delhi, India. When we come back, we continue on the climate crisis by looking at the fires still raging in California. The Congress member we'll speak to is calling for PG&E to become a public utility. Then we'll speak with a woman who is a former prisoner who fought fires while incarcerated. We'll also talk about the housekeepers and the workers who are going to estates that are burning, where the owners have evacuated, but the people are not told. Stay with us.
Luciérnagas, mamíferas, naturaleza.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Extreme winds of up to 60 miles per hour caused new fires to erupt across Southern California Wednesday, prompting tens of thousands to evacuate. The blazes are just the latest in a spate of climate change-fueled fires threatening the state. In Ventura County, north of Los Angeles, the so-called Easy Fire came nearly to the doorstep of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library as hundreds of firefighters worked to control the blaze. This is a homeowner in the area.
I've lived in California all my life here in Southern California, and we've always encountered the Santa Ana winds and the fires, but not to this extent. So in the last 5 years, it's been a little bit different, and like I said, it's a game changer for us all. It's the new normal.
News of the latest evacuations came after the National Weather Service in Los Angeles issued an extreme red flag warning for Southern California for the first time in its history. Fires in California are typical at this time of year, but the length and severity of the state's fire season has grown due to climate change. Evacuations have been lifted for the Getty Fire, which erupted in one of Los Angeles' most opulent neighborhoods on Monday.
In Northern California, firefighters have finally beat back the Sonoma County Kincaid fire that had forced nearly 200,000 people to flee their homes over the weekend. Firefighters reaching 45% containment of what had been the most threatening fire in California. Nearly all evacuees in the region have now been allowed to return to their homes. This comes as the public utility giant Pacific Gas and Electric said Wednesday it would begin restoring power to the 365,000 customers who were plunged into darkness over the weekend as fires first erupted across the state. PG&E, the corporation that controls most of Northern and Central California's electricity and the biggest utility in America, has been implicated in many of the fires that have ravaged California in recent years, including the Camp Fire that killed 85 people and completely destroyed the town of Paradise in 2018. In January, PG&E declared bankruptcy, facing a number of lawsuits related to the wildfires, but it still controls much of California's power grid. For more, we go to a lawmaker who's calling for the California state government to take over control of PG&E and make it a public utility. Congressmember Ro Khanna joins us now from Washington, D.C. Congressmember Khanna, later in the broadcast, we're going to talk to you about this epic day around the issue of impeachment. But right now, we're focusing on what's happening in California, which is also, to say the least, epic in this state of emergency. Explain for people around the world who don't understand how PG&E operates what it is now and what you are calling for.
Well, first of all, it has been a disaster in the Bay Area of where I live. People's homes are being destroyed by fire. Many thousands of people are without basic electricity. PG&E is basically a private monopoly that gets a return on investment for their private investors, but has no competition. It's the worst of both worlds. It's a monopoly, a private monopoly, and yet it has exclusive jurisdiction over a particular zone, so it doesn't have the competition that free markets usually have. And this has resulted in PG&E making systematic underinvestments. They have not secured the power lines. They have not engaged in the brush clearing that was necessary to make sure that these fires didn't escalate. They have no provision for backup power, even though this was completely foreseeable. At the same time, they're paying their CEO $9.8 million, and the investors are making money, and this mismanagement has led to bankruptcy. What I have said is, in a case where you have a private monopoly without competition, that's a case of public ownership where you're not having a profit motive and extractive capitalism. The state should take over PG&E, and different municipalities should run the power distribution for their cities, and then the state should provide it to rural areas where the cities can do the job.
Representative Ro Khanna, how common is it in the U.S. that gas and electricity are provided by private corporations? I mean, I myself was confused that this PG&E is called a public utility, but in fact it's private.
Well, it's technically a public investor utility. In other words, there is public regulatory oversight over it, the California Public Utilities Commission, but it's private investment, and it has a private board of directors, and they determine the executive compensation. And the public regulators really don't have much ability to move PG&E. At the same time, PG&E is pouring millions of dollars into the governor's campaign, into state legislators' campaigns. So the process has been co-opted by these special interests. Unfortunately, most of the country, many states, have public investment utilities, and this is why Bernie Sanders and his Green New Deal plan has said that we need to move to publicly owned utilities. And we know in publicly owned utilities, particularly municipalities, are much better. It's lower cost for residents. Their energy mix tends to be much more renewable. Their safety standard tends to be much higher, and you take the profit motive of extractive capitalism out of it.
And so what would need to happen for it to become an actual publicly owned utility controlled by the state of California? And can you explain, for example, how that might have changed the outcome of what happened in Paradise, California, which burned to the ground, killing 85 people last year?
Absolutely. Well, had PG&E been a publicly owned utility, instead of paying $9.8 million to the CEO, because there's no way California voters or taxpayers would have allowed that, PG&E would have been required to make the investments in the safety of the power lines. They would have been forced to make the investment in clearing out the brush or trees where they were in dangerous positions. I had someone in my district who said that PG&E had come 2 months ago saying 9 trees needed to be removed because they were a fire hazard, and no one has followed up. So there would be far more public accountability. There also would be a much larger source of renewable energy. In my district, Silicon Valley Power is a public utility in Santa Clara. They have almost 40% of their energy be renewable. They have lower rates, and they're much safer. So how do we get there? PG&E currently is in bankruptcy. Their entire market cap is about $2 billion. California, as you know, has a state surplus. We could easily take over the utility in bankruptcy, either by issuing bonds or by using some of that surplus.
We're going to break and then come back to talk about what's happening in California. In addition to Congressmember Ro Khanna, we'll be joined by Amika Mota, who is a former prisoner firefighter, and talk about what that means and for the prisoners today who are fighting fires. And we'll speak with an LA Times reporter who has been talking to people who are heading to these estates that are blazing, and the workers don't realize this. The owners have evacuated, but the workers haven't been told. Stay with us.
If I fall short, if I don't make the grade, if your expectations aren't met in me today, there's always tomorrow or tomorrow night. Hang in there, baby. Sooner or later, I know I'll get it right. Please don't give up on me. Oh, please don't give up on me. I know it's late in the game, but my feelings, my true feelings, haven't changed.
Don't Give Up on Me by Solomon Burke. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We're continuing to look at the climate-fueled fires raging across California, now turning to how the blazes are disproportionately affecting some of the state's most vulnerable communities. As the New York Times reports, a growing number of rich people are hiring private firefighters to protect their property for up to $3,000 per day. Domestic workers and gardeners who tend to some of the most opulent opulent homes in Los Angeles attended work despite the Getty Fire evacuation order earlier this week. Many of their employers failed to even tell them not to come in. That's according to a Los Angeles Times article headlined, "Housekeepers and Gardeners Go to Work Despite the Flames."
We're joined right now by the journalist who reported the story, Brittany Mejia. She joins us in Los Angeles. Welcome to Democracy Now! Tell us what you found in Housekeepers and Gardeners Go to Work Despite the Flames. Describe the situation for us.
Yeah, thanks so much, first off, for having me. So when I got sent out to the fire around 4 in the morning. And by the time I got to Brentwood, it was mostly evacuated. There were maybe a few people left trying to see if they could sit tight. But for the most part, it was completely empty. And then after I left a neighborhood where there were actually homes that burned, I saw a taxi coming in and dropping off a housekeeper who was pretty convinced that her bosses were still there because they hadn't called her. They didn't tell her anything. And there's just ash coming down and so much smoke in this neighborhood. And she's just ringing the bell. And, we quickly learned that her boss was not home and had evacuated at 3 in the morning. And so as we headed back, as I gave her a ride and we headed back down, we bumped into a significant number of other workers who had come in. There was a construction worker who made it to his job site and saw the fire and then left. Another woman who was trying to get into the mandatory evacuation zone to try and go to work because she also hadn't heard from her boss. A babysitter who was covering her face with a paper towel. The bus wouldn't take her to Pacific Palisades, and she ended up being stuck kind of right around this area. And so it was a significant amount of workers who, when we did get a hold of the bosses, or when I was able to talk to them, they just forgot to tell their workers not to come in.
And were the workers aware, Brittany, that there was an evacuation order in place?
Yeah, so that's the thing. No, this woman that was dropped off by the taxi, I honestly am not even sure how she got in. I think she was just really desperate to go to work that day. But yeah, I mean, she had no idea. She was like, oh, there's a helicopter. And, as we spoke, she observed there was a helicopter. And I was like, yeah, there's a lot of smoke. There's ash because there's a fire. It's pretty nearby. And so she, at that moment, I think I could tell she was scared, which she then told the owner, I'm scared to be here by myself.
Brittany, very quickly, you speak Spanish. You've been interviewing people in Spanish. Are all the orders going out in Spanish so people understand the dangers?
Yeah, that's the thing. I don't know how targeted it was to the workers who come into this neighborhood. I don't know if the focus was mostly on the people who live in Brentwood, which I'm sure that would be mostly, I feel like, English speaking. And so I don't know how much it was targeted because when I spoke to the workers, quite a few of them had no idea, at least about where the evac zone was. A few weren't even aware that there was a fire and learned when they arrived. So I don't know how much information they were getting to try and help their decision not to come to work.
So speaking of people in danger, we want to turn to the more than 4,000 firefighters working across California to contain the blazes. At least 700 of them are California prisoners, while salaried firefighters earn an annual mean wage of $74,000 a year, plus benefits. Prisoners earn about $1 an hour when fighting active fires. We go now to San Francisco, where we're joined by Amika Moda, former prisoner firefighter, policy director at Young Women's Freedom Center in San Francisco. Amika, well, we're back with you again. When we were in San Francisco going to the prison camps where the prisoners are that fight fires, that are very treasured by the free firefighters because they do so much of the most dangerous work. We're talking to you again. When you were imprisoned, when you were incarcerated, you were a firefighter. Explain the situation right now.
Well, I think that, thanks for having me back again, Amy. It's nice to talk to you. I think that, in California, we are certainly have a deep concern for our folks that are out there on the front lines fighting fires while incarcerated, as well as all of the other firefighters that are battling the blazes across California. I think that that the issues haven't changed much since we talked last time. We've worked on a number of legislative efforts to try to kind of balance out the inequities of a labor force that works fighting fires on the inside and then comes home and can't do the same. But I think that there's a couple of narratives that really exist about this force of incarcerated firefighters, and it's, is this a positive prison program that's benefiting incarcerated people, or is this a capitalist abuse of the most vulnerable population, which we know our prisons are warehoused with Black and brown folks. So I think that we are still at that same point.
What is astounding is the level of experience and danger they face and the experience they get when they get out of prison. Are not allowed to be firefighters, so end up often serving the rich, being private firefighters around estates.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think that it really doesn't make sense that, we come home and that there is this large barrier. We're not able to get EMT licenses, which is what we need to be working at municipal fire departments, because there are really clear restrictions on, being licensed when you have 2 or more felonies on your record, or you, have a charge that's 7 years or less. And so basically we have folks that are really trained up and have the potential to come home and be a really productive member of society and have stable careers. And that is not happening. We have folks that are coming home and unable to keep minimum wage jobs because of the barriers that exist.
Very quickly, I want to ask Congressmember Ro Khanna, this issue of the prisoners making like $1, is it $1 a day, Amika, or $1 an hour?
Well, at the fire camps, it's about $1 an hour.
About $1 an hour.
53 cents.
Is there a discussion? When we were there, the commanders at the camp said these people should be making more than this. We're talking about more than 40 camps. That this has been the wage for decades.
It's outrageous, and there is a discussion in Congress. Yesterday, we actually posted on social media our outrage at how the prisoners are being treated. There's no excuse in this country to abuse the prison population. Obviously, there's incarceration, but once someone's a prisoner, they should be still compensated for basic labor. And certainly when they leave, as you pointed out, they should be able to reintegrate into society and have the value of the expertise and experience they've gained.
Also, on the issue of the fossil-fueled economy, before we get to impeachment, if you could make this very brief, I want to go to Syria, where President Trump has, abandoned the Kurds, but said that he is protecting the oil fields, both in northern Syria. That's where U.S. soldiers will go, and thousands he is sending to Saudi Arabia to protect their oil fields.
I appreciate you raising this because this is a blatant violation of the Geneva Convention. We can't send troops to extract oil. You can't steal oil from other countries. And our presence in Syria, it's important to realize, is still unconstitutional. There has been no congressional authorization. So it was appalling to hear the president say that.
Well, we want to thank Amika Moda of the Young Women's Freedom Center in San Francisco, talking to us about the imprisoned firefighters, and Brittany Mejia of the LA Times speaking to us from Los Angeles. This is Democracy Now!, but now we're going to turn with Ro Khanna to the issue of impeachment.
So we end today's show in Washington, where the House is holding a historic vote today to formalize the impeachment process against President Trump. The probe centers on whether Trump withheld military aid to Ukraine to pressure Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to investigate Trump's political rival Joe Biden and his son Hunter, who served on the board of Burisma Holdings, a Ukrainian energy company. Congressman Ro Khanna, you serve on the House Committee on Oversight and Reform. Talk about the significance of today's vote.
It's a very important vote. I commend Speaker Pelosi because we're going to have virtually a unanimous vote among the Democratic caucus to affirm the impeachment inquiry and to set forward the process going forward on how we're going to get to articles of impeachment and have a vote on impeachment. The important thing here to understand is that the evidence is overwhelming that the president was pressuring Zelensky into investigating his political rival. And it was not just one phone call. What we have seen emerge is a pattern, a conspiracy lasting months to use the United States government to benefit Donald Trump's own reelection campaign.
Well, the Republicans, of course, have condemned the entire inquiry, saying it's undemocratic. So could you respond to that? And how do you think Republican members of the House are likely to vote?
Well, it hasn't been undemocratic. In fact, the process has been followed in a very, very fair way. We have had a private setting for investigations and fact-gathering. In that setting, Republicans have been able to be there. They've been able to ask questions. They've been able to examine witnesses. The reality is they're the ones who've been obstructing the process. Now that the fact-gathering is ending, the hearings are going to be public, and the president's lawyers are going to have due process rights. What is so sad in this process is the attack on civil servants that is basically undermining public service. I mean, there used to be a stature to serving in government, and it's government that has done so many extraordinary things, from innovation to helping protect American security. And the Republicans have launched a systematic attack on career civil servants to try to defend this president. Explain
particularly around around the testimony of Vindman and the significance of who he is and what happened behind closed doors, if you know, the screaming match that took place as the Republicans tried to use that moment to get at the identity of the whistleblower, thinking it was the whistleblower who he spoke to.
Well, Vindman is a patriot. I mean, he is someone who is won the Purple Heart, who has served this country honorably. And you have the president's allies going on television, accusing Vindman of having dual loyalties, accusing him of conspiracy theories, accusing him of betraying the interests of the United States. And all Vindman did was comply, as he was legally required to do, with the congressional subpoena, congressional inquiry for testimony. And what he did is testify to the best of his knowledge. So the attack on people like Vindman
is an attack
He's a lieutenant colonel
who Fox is suggesting has committed treason.
Yes, and this is an attack on people who are not political. They're not people who are working on Trump or any campaign. These are people who are serving our country. And you've seen now this is not just with Vindman. This is with people at the State Department. It's with our intelligence officers. It's with career civil servants. Republicans are basically saying that they're not worthy, they're dishonest, they're unpatriotic. And so I ask you, how, when we're doing this, how are people going to have faith in government? Why are the next great scientists, the next great leaders going to want to work with the United States government? What a loss for us at a time when our government really helped create the Internet, helped create antibiotics, helped create sensors, and we're going to now diminish government at a time where we need a strong government partnership with the private sector and research universities for America to compete. So the Republicans, it's not just this president. It's important to understand that they're inflicting so much damage on the institutions of our democracy and government.
Finally, will these impeachment hearings be televised?
Yes, they absolutely will. They will be televised. The testimony will be public, and Republicans will get to ask questions. But I think here's what the Republicans are realizing.
We got to leave it there.
The attack on process isn't going to work. They have no defense for the conduct of the president.
Congressmember Ro Khanna, thanks so much. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.